Hello everyone, I'm Nitij, and in this session we will build a project using React combined with Firebase Functions. You will learn how to seamlessly integrate these powerful tools to enhance your web development skills. So to get started, first you will need to go to your existing Firebase project, and then you have to click on this build drop down menu and then click on functions. When you will do that, then in your project shortcuts you will start to see the functions option. When you will click on functions, then you will need to activate them. So I have already done that for this project, but essentially you will have to follow a couple of steps, and one of them is for you to upgrade your project to Blaze or paid subscription, which simply means that you will not be using the free tier, which is called as Spark. To upgrade your project to Blaze plan, you will have to enter your payment information, and then you will have to set a budget, which if you will cross, you will get a warning email from Firebase that this limit has been crossed. But if you are just using Firebase for your personal learning, then I don't think that any of the limits are going to get crossed, because in the free tier or in the Spark tier you get enough usage or enough free usage for you to build a full-fledged project while also testing and deploying your application. Alright, so after you have done setting up your functions in your Firebase project, the next thing you need to do is to go to your React project and then install the Firebase tools. So this is Visual Studio Code, and this boilerplate code which I'm using is from another tutorial video where I have already shown you how to integrate the Firebase backend along with its authentication with a React frontend project. So we will not be covering that entire process again. If you want to know how to integrate Firebase backend with your React UI frontend, then you can watch that tutorial video by opening the link which I have shared in the description. When you have already integrated Firebase backend with your React frontend, then to be able to use Firebase backend serverless functions, you will first have to install the Firebase tools by executing command npm install and then Firebase tools in your terminal. Press enter. So while they are installing, let's talk a little bit about Firebase functions. So Firebase functions are basically serverless functions for which you don't need a full-fledged backend application or backend node environment for them to function. You just build or create individual functions in the environment provided to you by Firebase, and then you deploy those individual functions. When it's time to call any backend function, then you can call them individually, and then they are able to run all kinds of backend logic, and then you can return values or data from those serverless functions as well. So serverless simply means that you don't really have to worry about the backend infrastructure that you will be using to set up your backend runtime environment. After installing Firebase tools, you will have to initialize the Firebase instance in your project, and to do that you will simply have to call Firebase and then init. This is assuming that you already have installed Firebase package from the previous tutorial video which I was talking about. Now the message says you are about to initialize a Firebase project. So are you ready to proceed? Press enter. Now you have to select the Firebase feature which you want to configure, and we want to configure the functions. Select them using space and then press enter. Now it is asking us for the project under which we want to configure the functions. So we already have created a project. If you don't have a project, then you can create a new one, but because we already have a project, I am going to select this option, use an existing project. Now it has given me the list of all the projects that I have in my Firebase account. So I'm just going to select the one which we have to use, which is this one, tutorial. Select it and then press enter. Now it is asking about the language. I'm gonna go with JavaScript. Do you want to use ESLint? Well, it's not required for this tutorial video. Do you want to install dependencies? Yes, I want to do that. So this step essentially creates a new folder with the name functions in our project directory, and all the functions are going to reside under this functions folder, and it's up to us how we want to structure the files and folders under this functions folder. And I will show you in a moment the very basic structure that you should absolutely use when working with Firebase serverless functions. In the end, it says Firebase initialization complete, and there are two messages. First one is writing configuration info to firebase.json and writing project information to .firebase.rc. Now let's see what these two files contain. First, let's go into and open up firebase.json. So this file has some configuration regarding our functions, and the second one is this one, .firebase.rc. It simply contains the project name under the property default. Now this is useful when we want to use different project instances when doing things like, let's say, deployment. It really helps to switch between different projects. For example, right now we have the default one as this one. Now if you want to use the dev instance of your project, suppose that you are also using this one as dev, then you can use a dev instance over here. Let's say that you have a separate project for the prod or production instance, then you will simply have to add another property with the name prod and with the value of the project which you are using for your production instance. Well, anyways, let's close this one and move on to the next step, which is going to the functions folder and then creating a new folder which is going to be called as callable functions. In the default setting, we only have a single index.js file when we first initialize the Firebase for functions, but this is really counterintuitive because we cannot really write all of our functions in a single index.js file. So to properly arrange all the functions in a meaningful manner, it is best to use the modularized approach and then write the functions, but then import them as individual modules in this index.js entry point. So we are going to do just that. First, I'm just going to remove everything from this index.js file and then go to your callable functions folder. Under this folder, I will create a new file with the name myfunction.js. Okay, so for this myfunction.js, I'm just going to paste some boilerplate code which I'm going to explain to you as well what it is all about. So in this myfunction, first we are importing the required packages for functions and for admin. Now functions is to call the function and admin is to initialize our app if it is not already initialized, and that can be done by simply checking the existing length of the apps. If it is 0, then we always have to call admin.initializeApp. Now to create a callable function, we simply have to follow this syntax where we simply write functions.https.onCall and then we provide a function as a callback. Over here we have an async function. Now there is another option which is .runWith, and here we can provide an object with some options. Over here for an example, I have provided timeout in seconds, which is 540. So if your function needs to stay active for a long time, longer than usual, then you can provide the timeout in seconds, which is a fixed value, but there is a certain limit to it. Normally, you don't really need to use .runWith for normal functions if you are just doing standard operations like writing to a backend file store or calling a third-party API. But if you are doing something else like calling a third-party API whose response is going to take some time to return to your function, then you may choose to run your function with a specific timeout. So there is a certain way in which we can invoke a callable function from the front end by providing some data, and in the backend we will get the data as well as the function context. This context has certain values, but the most important one is the auth. So you can know if the user which is calling this function is authenticated or not. Let's say if you want this function to be invoked and run for only authenticated users, then you can check for context.auth. If it is not present, then you can simply throw an error. Well, anyways, let's move on with what is going on with this function. So right now this function is only returning a single property with the name success, which is set to true. So when we will invoke this function from our React frontend, then we will be able to get the value of success, and when that will be done, then we can be sure that our backend function is invoking successfully. Now it's time to import this functions dependency in the index.js file so that we are able to deploy it. So to do that, the first thing that we have to do is to install the express and cors packages in our functions folder. So cd functions and then npm install express and cors. Now in index.js, the first thing that we need to do is to import the express and cors packages. Then we need to create a new express app, and then if you want to whitelist certain domains, then you have to use the cors middleware. And then comes the important bit where we import our function. So const my function equals to require, and then we have to give its path, so /callable functions, and then the function name, which is my function. And then finally we just have to call exports dot my function equals to my function. Now after this is done, how do we actually test this function code? Do we have to always deploy it to the server to test it? Well, we can simply run a local emulator suite where we will be able to call this function by hosting it locally. So to be able to emulate functions locally, what we have to do is, first in this project, go to the existing firebase.js file, and in this file I will have to add certain steps which make sure that the emulator is up and running. So to do that, first I will have to import get functions and connect functions emulator from Firebase Functions. Next we have to check if we are in the development mode by simply checking env.node_env. Then we have to connect the functions emulator to localhost port 5001. So let me show you how it's done. First, just add a condition to check the current environment. Then fetch all the functions by simply calling get functions and then providing our Firebase app as an argument. And then finally call the connect functions emulator function by providing the functions as an argument and providing the host name and then providing the port number. Now to shorten this code, we can also call get functions directly over here as well. So that is also something that you can do. The next thing that I will be doing is to add a emulate command in our package.json file, which will make it pretty easy to run the emulator whenever we want it to. So to do that, open up your package.json file and then go to scripts and add a new script with the name Firebase emulate. Now to start the emulator, we just have to execute the command Firebase use, and then after use we have to provide the project name. So remember I was talking about the Firebase RC file where we have the list of projects, and you can use the project which you want to emulate. So if you want to emulate the functions in the production environment, then you can write prod in the command. If you want to emulate the functions in the dev environment, then you can do that as well. So right now I'm just going to emulate the default projects functions. So for that I will simply write Firebase use default, and after this you will have to execute another command which is Firebase emulators and then start. Now save it. Now let's see if our emulator is working correctly or not. So open up terminal and then I'm just going to execute command npm run Firebase emulate. It says now using alias default, which is this project. So it says, hold on, let me just scroll up. It says functions US central 1. This is our functions location, my function, the function name. It says HTTP function initialized, and this is the function URL. All emulators ready. It is now safe to connect your app. So our functions emulator is working, and now we are able to call our backend function using our React frontend. So remember, we added this condition if our project is running in the development mode. It simply means that when we are working in the dev mode, then our frontend is going to call the functions which are deployed in the emulator and not in our functions hosting. Without this piece of code, your frontend code will not be able to call the emulated functions. Well, anyways, it is now time to invoke the Firebase function from a React's component. So in our boilerplate code from the past tutorial, we already have a home component where we can invoke this my function. To do that, first we have to import the dependencies for get functions and HTTPS callable. Next, I am just going to add another div below the existing message one. So let's do that. So this is the div which I have added. Now to test our backend function, I am going to add a state variable with a default value. Now the name of the state variable is message, so message and then set message, and I will use the default value of default message. So when this page will open up, then default message is going to be printed on this page, and when we will call the function, if it's invoked successfully, then we are going to update this message to some other message indicating that our function has been successfully invoked. Now let's create a function to invoke our backend function and also a button which will invoke our components function. So async function and then call my function. Function. Now over here we can simply fetch the reference of our backend function by calling const my function equals to https callable, and then the first argument is going to be the list of functions, so get functions, and then we have to provide the name of our backend function, which is this one, my function, and it's simple as that. Now let's use the try and catch blocks. So try and then catch error. Now in try, first let's create a const for the data which we are going to send to our backend function. Now this data is optional, you can choose to not send any data, but I'm just going to show you how this can be done. So right now I'm just going to initialize it with an empty object literal. Now we can fetch the result by simply writing const result equals to await and then call my function as a regular JavaScript function, and also provide the data as an argument, and that is pretty much all you need to do. Now let's check the value of the success property of the data. So remember, in our function we were returning the success property as true, so we just have to check if it's true, then the function is returning correct data. So if result dot data dot success, if it is available and true, then we can simply update our message state variable with another message with something like Firebase function called successfully. In the else part we can simply write Firebase function has an error. Although if there is an error, then it is going to be get caught by the catch block, and that is everything we need to do to invoke our backend function. Now let's add the button which when clicked is going to call my function, and I am going to add it over here. So this is a button which has an on click attribute with the value of invoking our local call my function with the text call Firebase function. Now it's time to test our code if it's working correctly or not. So remember, we are already emulating the backend function. Now it's time to start our React front-end application. So for that, first in this second terminal I will do cd ... to go back to our React project, and then simply write npm and then start. So this is our React front-end, and I'm just going to sign in as a user first so that we are able to see the home page. Now this is the home page with the button call Firebase function and the default message. Let's just click on this button to see if we are able to invoke the backend function or not. Now the message has updated to Firebase function called successfully. Now one way to be sure that our function is indeed getting called is to check that out in the terminal where the emulator is running. So let's open up this first terminal, and let me just zoom out a little bit. Over here you can see that there are a bunch of messages logged. So it says beginning execution of US Central 1 my function. These are all the arguments. In the end it says finished this function execution in this much time. So whenever the function will be finished executing, then you will see some message like this. If you have logged something from your function, then you will see that value being logged in this terminal so that you are able to debug what is happening in your function. And if there is an error, then it will be logged in this terminal as well. So it's pretty straightforward and convenient to see what's going on with our functions. And let me show you one more thing which is related to how you can deploy your functions using the command line. Although you should always use a CI/CD pipeline such as GitHub Actions to do that, or you can specify them directly as well. But in any case, let me just show you two commands which you can use to deploy your functions on multiple environments. So using this one, you can deploy your Firebase functions on dev, and using this command you can deploy them in prod. So while you are working in dev mode, you may want to deploy only functions in the dev mode to be able to test them if they are working correctly while getting deployed on server or not. So this is the command Firebase use, and then alias, which I have already showed you, and then Firebase deploy only function. This parameter tells Firebase that it needs to deploy only functions. So guys, that was all about building our project with React and Firebase functions and doing the integration of a very basic setup. I hope you found this walkthrough helpful and insightful for your own development work. If you enjoyed this video and learned something new, then please consider subscribing to this channel. Once again, this is Nitij signing off. Happy coding, and I will see you in the next video.